All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you very much. My name is Art Swift. I'm the president of the prpl Foundation, and I'm here with a panel that I will introduce just in a moment. We're here to talk about an open source approach to securing the Internet of Things. First, I would like, though, to introduce the prpl Foundation, just so you know what we're all about. We're a nonprofit tech open source foundation. We're backed by some big chip companies like Intel and Qualcomm and Broadcom, several software companies, IP companies like Imagination Technologies, Synopsys, Elliptic, and so on. We've got about 30 members, and we have a big security focus. So the idea of this talk is really to leverage from the security guidance that we published earlier this year, which was a peer-reviewed document that went out to the industry for best practices for the IoT. Let me introduce my panelists. With me today are Phil Atfeld of Sequitur Labs. Sequitur is a leader in building trust into devices, both from a software and IP perspective. Next to Phil is Lubna Dajani, CSO for the company Interseed. And Interseed is a company that is all about building trust at all levels, and identity and trust together, and they'll have the opportunity to tell you more about that. And then lastly, Pim Tullis is here from his company Intrinsic ID, and they are developing cutting-edge technology for basically providing an individual fingerprint from a SoC device. So inherent to the device, completely unclonable, so the physically unclonable function. So now let me just give you the backdrop, the perspective that we have on the Internet, the Internet of Things. Basically, we see it as the Internet of broken things. So if you look at the expanse, we've seen recently the hacking of the Chrysler Jeep products by security researchers. Relatively straightforward approach. They reverse engineered some of the key interfaces. They moved laterally within the system. They reflashed the software, and they were able to take control of a car. Well, in a similar fashion, that same kind of hacking strategy was used against drug pumps. Again, given the cyber criminal or researcher the ability to actually control doses in hospital drug pumps and the like. And that could really result, obviously, in fatalities under misuse. Not sure how many of you noticed the news about the 737s being hacked in flight from the in-flight infotainment systems. Luckily, it was done by a security researcher as opposed to a cyber terrorist, but they were able to gain control of the engine control systems, raise the plane, lower the plane, spin up the engines, and so on. And then finally, there's even weapons that are supposedly more accurate, but can be taken control of by cyber criminals by the same approach. So what's in common? Reverse engineering, exploiting a weak implementation, modifying the firmware or reflashing it, and then moving laterally in the system. And what are some of the solutions that we in the prpl Foundation see? Open source implementations where more eyes looking at a set of code generally makes it more secure. Interoperability and open standards such that all of us can work together. Having a root of trust embedded in the devices, and the heavy use of virtualization. So with that, let me turn to my panel and ask you the first question, which is, given this backdrop, so this backdrop of Internet of broken things where lives are really at risk now, it's not just money, it's not just financial pain, it's not company reputation, but in the IoT, it could really be life. If you look at the 737 example or any of the others. So if each of you could talk a little about how your company might help secure that, you can tell people a little more about your company and what contributions you could make to beginning to solve this kind of problem. Pim, can I start with you and the...
Can you switch? Okay. Is it clear? Yeah, so my name is Pim Tullis. I'm from Intrinsic ID. We basically provide the means to provide the root of trust in the devices and to make sure that devices can be properly authenticated. Because indeed, many of the examples that, that Art gave are essentially, they are authentication problems. Yeah? Almost all security problems, I would say, start with authentication or a lack of authentication often. The example with somebody getting access to certain systems in an airplane, it is an authentication problem in the end. Somebody gets access to a system he or she shouldn't get access to. Yeah, when let's say, another example is a car being hacked, a very famous example of Chrysler. Clearly, the hackers should not get access to that car. Again, it's an authentication problem. So if you start really analyzing the situation, you will see that many problems are in essence authentication problems. And authentication means that you need to be able to recognize another system. Yeah, as human beings, we do that all the time. Yeah, I recognize Art because I've met him a few times, so I know it's him. It's very implicit, of course. But when systems start talking to each other, yeah, and what we are currently doing is we talk to each other via a phone, via a computer, via an iPad. We don't know anymore what is happening. You type some information into the system, and from then on you completely rely on the fact that that system works in a trustworthy manner. That it only talks to other, let's say, trusted parties and provides the information to, in the end, the party that should receive it. And of course, this is still an example where users are part of the system. But in IoT, often it will be talking between two chips, two machines, a sensor to a computer, and the computer will autonomously take decisions based on the information that it gets from the sensor. And that means it has to be sure that that information is trustworthy, it has not been changed, and that the sensor is trustworthy. And the sensor was not counterfeit, the sensor was not replaced, and all these kind of things. So based on a hardware root of trust inherently present in the chips, yeah, you can guarantee indeed that the communication is authentic, the components are authentic, you can put good, strong authentication and identification in place, and you can start building really a trustworthy system. And we as a company, we are at the core of that and provide technology to build up the system from the basic startup.
Very good. So could I turn now to Phil, who actually sort of works at the next level up the security chain?
Absolutely, thank you. So what we do is actually we leverage a hardware root of trust. And we work with, say, off-the-shelf parts that typically we do, call it a teardown of the data sheet before we actually will agree to support the part. So in terms of the bus fabric, the ability to hard segregate peripherals or memory or the device themselves, we do a rather in-depth analysis of a device before we'll even consider porting software to it. Even with a hardware root of trust, if there is no hard mechanism for isolating boundaries between execution environments, so some hardware enforced mechanism, we've seen the best chips that incorporate security and virtualization, and there's no separation. Without that, and without a mechanism at that interface, it's like a lock on a door. Without a policy and an enforcement mechanism, you really don't have any security either, because you can just transition through to what's supposed to be secure and stomp all over it. So we actually build software stacks and support the manufacturing of devices. We support the manufacturers in taking their devices to third-party manufacturers to have them built. And at this point as well, we actually consult with the silicon designers to help them get their bus fabrics and features right, so that you can actually build decent software to run on top of the chips. Because too many times we spotted, oh wait, there's a problem here. You need to do a respin. So we now get called in very early during development stages by the silicon and spec teams to help them actually develop their part, and then we support them through the process to release the software for them, and then work with their customers.
Very good. And now Lubna, one step up again in the whole chain of trust. So Lubna's company is all about credentialing and ID and building trust across multiple levels.
Right. So I'm Lubna Dajani, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Interseed, as opposed to Chief Security Officer. But and our pedigree comes from identity and credentials. We issue identity and credentials to smart cards for physical and logical access. 16 federal agencies rely on our technology, banks, aerospace and defense and what have you. And that's where our pedigree comes from. And then our second product, TAM, which is a trusted application manager that enables a service provider to deliver their trusted applications to the device, leveraging whatever the trusted execution environments that are available on device. And we have another layer of technology, we call it Rapid, which enables a application developer to use strong authentication in issuing their application. So it's establishing deep-level trust between a server and a device on an application-per-application level. So that's what we have traditionally done and we continue to do. But we're also now have taken advantage of our technology that we've already established over the 15 years, breaking it down into like Lego blocks, if you will, and re-leveraging it to work with the industry across all silicon providers to enable digital trust and security for the entire chain from the silicon through the service. And it's not to say that we're offering products and all that, but we are working with each layer to enable interoperability and openness so that we can actually compete on the value add, but establish a collaborative environment, an open trust environment that really what prpl really stands for, which is why we're working so closely with prpl, because we want to enable adoption, but we want to deliver it in a secure way and in a trusted way where, so in some cases you need very strong authentication, which we also believe is at the heart of it, but we want to ensure that you can authenticate and utilizing that root of trust, which Puff is an example of, to secure the communication, to be able to pass it on in an open way so you can interchange the pieces as you will, but also have, as a service provider, oversight and ability to secure the entire chain. But the entire chain is exactly that, a chain. So, and you need to be able to plug in and out in a meaningful way that preserves security and privacy, but also leaves open access to people.
Very good. So you've heard some common themes from 3 different companies, interestingly enough. So building security into the hardware in some kind of a root of trust capability or physically unclonable function. You've heard about the need for authentication, and embedded in there was security by separation, trusted execution environments versus untrusted. So now let me move to a topic that's quite controversial. As you know, regulators, or maybe you don't know, regulators are very actively involved in taking a look at how to make the IoT more secure. And for instance, there was a recent FCC set of regulations that came out that basically locked down wireless routers such that consumers couldn't replace the software, upgrade the software, or for instance, replace the software with the popular OpenWRT distribution. The reason they did this was they were trying to protect and secure the wireless spectrum. But what they did is they basically eliminated the use of a very popular open source platform. And so the open source community can no longer develop, they could no longer deploy, they couldn't use that capability. Now, on the other hand, the FCC really had good intentions. Obviously, you want to control the wireless spectrum. It's a limited resource that we all have to share. But it goes further. You know, based on the Jeep hacking incident, there's been regulations suggested that consumers should no longer be able to work on their cars. Think about also the VW smog crisis, where they fudged their test results for the EPA. And so there's an idea of that, well, we should lock down all those interfaces so you couldn't upgrade the software in your car. So I'd like to turn to my colleagues here and say, do you think the involvement of the regulators is a good thing? And if so, how can we best work with them to make sure that the solutions they come up with are good ones? Phil, you look like you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I'm an old guy. I've been through this before. So I think back to the days of privacy debates going back, say, 15, 20 years, especially in Europe, where companies were holding, say, personal information or billing records. And in a lot of cases, the legislators may have gone too far in terms of putting requirements in terms of how information needed to be treated. At the flip side, what the industry was actually looking for was guidance from government on how to do it. Because if a company's faced with a situation where they're building a product where there may be liability associated with it, if all of a sudden they're legislated to have to perform, say, essentially what a lot of these schemes turn into is very high assurance review processes, those aren't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes they can be overreaching, prices typically go up as a result, but generally you don't get garbage for it. When I think as well, Art mentioned the example of the gentleman who took control of basically the engine on the aircraft. Yeah, the pilot knew very quickly. But the side of that as well in thinking in terms of assurances of systems, the quality generally goes through the roof. You know, when you think back as well, when airbags and seatbelts were first mandated, the auto companies knew that they wanted to put this stuff in. It just makes it easier for them to spend the money and say, I have no choice, now I have to. And it also lifts a lot of risk off of their plate. So not always a bad thing, hopefully not overreaching. And for the ones who still want to develop with OpenWRT, do it in a VM, pull off the antenna. Do it in another environment.
That's a really interesting approach, and it's funny enough one that we advocate and we've demonstrated. So the idea of breaking up the software into isolated sections and locking down the section that the regulators need to close on, but leaving everything else open for innovation.
Because if you leave it open that way as well, somebody's going to take the feature, hand it back to the manufacturer, sell it back to the manufacturer, incorporate it in the stack, goes back out with an FCC stamp on it, and you're done. You made your contribution, you get the software another way. And it will go through a QA channel, it works.
Anything to add, Lubna?
No, I completely agree. I think there's a place for regulation and for regulatory to establish a baseline, but you have to leave room for innovation.
Pim, your company is originally based out of Europe, out of Eindhoven, right? And so,
Correct.
Do you have a different perspective from a European point of view on the regulatory environment?
No. I think I share more or less the opinion here. I think regulation is needed in some systems. Yeah, that's also clear. I mean, if the systems are completely open, we will run into more trouble than we have already. Having said that, I think regulation and innovation can go together. And that's really what we should figure out. Where is that boundary?
Yeah.
Where is that balance such that they can go together? There are some critical parts where you don't want, let's say, everybody to fiddle around with his own software and trying things out. You have other parts where okay, people can try things out. There is no problem with that, but we have to know where it is. And on some of the more critical parts, you can also install a process such that innovation can flourish, but that there is kind of a, let's say, a checking mechanism that says, hey, this is a quality thing that was built, and this can be downloaded into a car or into a plane or into whatever. But there has to be a process in place.
Well, Pim, that's a perfect lead into the next question, actually. So, and again, this is a bit controversial. And it really revolves around proprietary software that's completely closed, and the idea being you can provide security by obscurity. In other words, if you don't have access to the source code and you can't get at it, well, isn't that inherently more secure than open source software where you can see everything? So there's a huge debate in the industry as to whether open source plays a key role. Is it inherently more secure? Or is there a combination of the two that's actually the best? Why don't you start?
Yeah, so this is, again, interesting question. First of all, security by obscurity doesn't work. Yeah, we have seen that. It's known for quite some time that if you don't open up what you're doing and you don't let experts review how your stuff works, in security, that's a bad idea. Yeah, it's as simple as that. things have been broken because of that. There are numerous examples out there where people thought nobody will crack this because they don't know what we put inside, how can they figure out, and all these kind of things. Well, those guys figure out. Yeah? The guys that figure out have time enough, usually have money enough to sit through it and to figure out how the system works. So if it's not well designed, you will lose anyway. Now, can you make it completely? Does that mean you should make it completely open? It is of course a different question. Again, at least there should be, I think, a willingness to make it open if needed. So you should be prepared to let your stuff be evaluated. And should that be by everybody, or should that be by, let's say, a certain committee or whatever? Yeah, that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, there might clearly be secrets inside that you want to open up to experts who are bound to certain confidentiality agreements, and there is no problem with that, but you just cannot disclose it to the whole world immediately. Yeah, so I think, again, this is a balancing act. But I think absolutely we should avoid that we start building systems based on obscurity. That would be a bad idea.
And Lubna or Phil, so do you see a way that open source allows the industry to cooperate on areas that perhaps are sort of fundamental? They don't necessarily differentiate, but why should we all reinvent the wheel on things that are just fundamental and basic if they're not differentiators? Isn't that a good place for open source?
It's a good starting point for it. So I look at one of the, I won't name it as a blatant plug, but one of the I'd say software stacks we work with. It has a pedigree. It came out of an environment where it was actually certified, and it was taken open. The code's been refactored and rewritten substantially. So what you get out of this is what I'll call a really, really solid baseline. We tear into it, it's open, it's exposed, it's there for everybody to see. And what we do is turn around and work with that to add in the features that actually take it to production. And in going to production, that means we have to work with labs. So I've sat on both sides of the table in terms of common criteria. I've been on the government side or on certified labs. I've been on the customer side and been through it. And these are not painful, it's just discipline. And I mean, they're not scary things. The same thing goes for payment terminals and devices. There's a reason they decap the chip and rip it apart. There's a reason they literally look at the bus fabric and the emanations of the parts. This is part of the process. I mean, this may not be required for your light bulb, but if you care about the IP in your bulb, maybe you want to do it. It really, fundamentally, there is a place for it in a baseline. I'm nervous at times, and one of the things I'm very cautious of in the software that we do use from the open source community is watching the contributions. If it's a totally wide open environment where anybody can submit code, get nervous about what's coming in because you may be inheriting somebody else's bug, and if nobody catches it. So I think in terms of poster child is OpenSSL. It's been through FIPS how many times? And it's still basically, recently, timing attacks to recover the key because it took longer to exponentiate a 0 than a 1. And they're able to recover the key through timing and clock cycle analysis. These are the sorts of things that are not obvious. And back to Art's original example on the FCC, you don't want to take away people's analytical abilities and make it illegal for them to do these things because they find problems, bring them to light. And as a result, sort of, you want to call the other side of the community, they actually contribute back in a very positive way as well.
Very good, thank you. And Lubna, what's your company's open source philosophy?
We're a big supporter of open source. We think it's very important that the communication protocols are open so that you can enable access. So we're big believers in innovation through collaboration and in collaborating on the basics, and then you can compete on value add.
Right.
So compete on what's in the black boxes in each of the chain, in the chain of trust, but the communication protocols need to be open so that you can customize what you need, retain control, and by the same time having security and privacy, because sometimes they end up sitting on the opposing side of the table if if there's too much control, there is not enough oversight. But I think if you compete on the basics, collaborate on the basics and compete on the value add, you have the formula, which is, again, why we're very excited about Purple, because it's really all about that at the heart of it.
Very good. Well, then let's turn to the next area. You've heard a lot about the fact that security by obscurity doesn't work, but a new theme that all of us see is security by separation. And there's a couple different approaches that are prevalent in the industry today. There's one based on a trusted execution environment and another approach based on virtualization. And Phil actually is an expert in both. And so I'm just wondering if you could contrast them and give a little...
Absolutely. Fundamentally, it comes down to hardware isolation and hardware enforced mechanisms. So the objective in security is really to create a boundary and enforce that. It can be physical separation, it can be a bus, it can be different peripherals. The objective is to enforce the separation somehow. So whether that's a security state coming off of a processor, whether it's a separate processor with a transaction going sideways, but whether it's an MMU changing state that starts locking out physical resources, they're basically the same but different in many ways. Specifically that Qualcomm problem, I think it was another write-up called Bits Please, really interesting. It was a software fault. Underpinning it was actually, I would say, there's a very subtle detail that Qualcomm could implement in the CPU that would prevent it. They just didn't. It's sort of one of these things that gets about 2 lines and a hardware implementation guide for the core. And there's a signal that you can assert that basically prevents further tampering. And if you really want to build something secure, lock it after boot so that not even the OS that's running in it can change it, even if it's breached. It's possible, they just don't implement it. I don't know that they do. So the mechanisms are generally there. The scary part is it takes a lot of digging and understanding of a lot of detail to basically cover, to make sure that the potentials for exploit are covered in advance. I mean, there's always something weird like overwriting a register for an MMU and then you're in underneath. The same thing, on a lot of implementations. You have to look carefully at what you're buying.
Sorry, so we fully agree. I think there's a time and place. There's for both. I think the separation works for nodes in a larger network, but then the TE type of implementations are also useful and very effective in high activity types of applications. I think there's a time and place for both. It's not one or the other. It's what's really important is the implementation and how it's designed at the end. But both scenarios, right. Both technologies work well for the right purpose.
Right. And Pim, your technology, the physically unclonable function, really applies in either way, right?
Yeah, our technology is quite horizontal. Yeah, so can support absolutely separation. Can of course support strong hardware-based security. And I think that is one of the main things we have to figure out is how much do you have to do in the hardware. I think software security, probably we all know, pure software-based security is also flawed. So you need to have some hardware components in place to build a good security system. And the question is really how much hardware do you need? I think that's a very important open question here.
Very good. Well then let's just close out by asking you all, how optimistic are you about putting trust in the IoT in an environment that today you can trust nothing? You can just basically assume that there's no trust in the whole system. So are you optimistic about the future, that 5 years from now or 10 years from now we'll have a much more secure IoT?
I'm optimistic we are going to build more secure systems because we'll have to. So that I'm certainly optimistic about. Closing the full gap, that will be impossible on the short term because a lot still has to happen to make that possible. Yeah, so much more security hooks have to be put into the hardware to make this happen. But I'm quite optimistic that in 5 to 10 years from now, we will have much more secure systems than we currently have.
I'm really optimistic, actually. And the reason I'll say that is because my phone's ringing more frequently, a lot more, in the course of the past 6 to 9 months than it was, say, a year ago. The good news, so I said there's good news and bad news. The bad news is their companies are not going to make it through the gap. Their products will fail, they may lose their brands, those companies will go down. And it will be partly for their own, either they deliberately made a decision not to do something, or they passively just didn't because they didn't know any better. Can't really help. Sometimes, you can try and help move people forward, and if you can't help them, well, don't beat yourself up over it. When we talk with, say, for example, white goods manufacturers, they realize that connecting a gas range to the internet is potentially a dangerous thing to do, because you don't want somebody getting control of the valve by accident. So I'm actually quite optimistic, and when I see the directions that software is going in terms of further evolution of hardware, further levels of integration, new bus fabrics and architectures, I guess it's improving. At the same time, we'll never achieve perfection. There'll be bugs in hardware, there will be bugs in software, and we're just going to have to keep marching forward and raising the bar every step. We have no choice, because what works today eventually will get broken tomorrow for the $10,000 something or another off of eBay. But we just keep moving forward.
And
Lubna, you can close out our discussion. So how do you feel about the future? You're a well-known futurist.
I get the last word. So it's the same question. Like we've asked, does anybody need a more than 256K processor in a computer, or who's going to need a website or really mobile? There was a huge debate. I was involved. When is mobile a viable technology? So at the end of the day, Pandora's box is open. You cannot stop evolution. It's here. We are, in fact, I believe in the future, not only devices and people are connected, but the environments will be also connected. Everything will be connected. There will be sensors and chips and everything, in the paint and the floor, and your clothes, and the seats you're sitting on, and everything. And potentially, and not potentially, already, all of that is already here inside of the person's body. So is it going to happen? Yes. That's not the problem. It's the color of it. It's the quality of life. And what does it mean to people, and how do we interact? What kind of commercial models? What's life going to look like? And that's going to be drastically changing. And it is changing. We're like a frog in that slowly boiling pot of water. There's nothing we can do to stop it. It's a matter of how do we manage it and control it, and how do we create it such that the individual right is addressed, and that we have freedom and we have privacy. At the same time, we have security without the perceived fear of threat of this and that. And I believe, in fact, personally, and I'll speak totally personally as myself and as a futurist, but a humanitarian rather, I think at the end of the day, it's all about the quality of life that we create. And anything that you can make, if we can make it, somebody can break it. So that's why I think it's very, very important to establish security. That's why I moved into security for the last few years, even though it's been a very closed world in the past, but because it's essential to ensuring a quality of services in the future and a quality of life. It's essential to be able to authenticate, and not just individual against a service, but a service against a service against a device against any 2 points of communication. There has to be authentication at each point, and then a set of policy or rules, logic, algorithms in between. That's what's in between the black boxes that will define that. But at the end of the day, you have to ensure that it's open, accessible, scalable, and secure down to the level of hardware with manageable control, so that not one entity or a few entities, I don't care if it's government or corporates, that will control the end-to-end, because you will then lose who you are in the process. So, and that's what I think, that's why open is very important. That's why we're working with Purple. And we'll, also you'll hear soon about Open Trust Protocol Alliance that's will be announced, I think, on the 20th officially. But it's an open protocol, communication protocol between a client and a server, but it's really between two endpoints. Regardless of what physical hardware it's sitting on or what software platform. At the end of the day, end-to-end has to be ensured, and to ensure that you have to have strong authentication, and then the rest works from there. It's true.
Well, I think it's a very good thing that some of the world's leading security companies are very optimistic about the future of the IoT. So if you would like to learn more about the specific philosophy and guidance that the Purple Foundation has put out for best practices for designing security into the IoT, if you go to the purple.work site, you'll find our peer-reviewed security guidance document that was published earlier this year. And actually, at this show, we demonstrated the second revision of our security by separation philosophy that leverages a great deal of open source work as well. So I'd like to thank my panelists. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for collaborating together. Are there any final questions from the audience? Yes.